This talk and the work I'm going to do with the teachers tomorrow is based on the book, the cover of which you see there. And I want to start by telling you the story of how I got into this kind of work. I was working for a small Catholic college in Regina, Campion College. They had a Catholic studies program that wasn't getting a lot of students registering for classes. And the president of the college said, well, we have an ed faculty. The Campion College is on the campus of a larger secular university. There's an ed faculty across the way, and like a quarter or a third of those students are going to go on to work in Catholic schools. We have a large publicly funded Catholic school system. That's a double-edged sword. We can talk about that later. But a lot of the students from the University of Regina ed faculty go on to teach in Catholic schools. And so he thought, well, maybe we could offer a course for prospective Catholic teachers. So we went down to the local Catholic school board's office, and we asked them this question. We said, if you were hiring someone, they're going to a secular university, but they can take one course in Catholic education, what would you want them to study in that one course? And they said, well, here's three things. First, curriculum permeation. Second, curriculum permeation. Now, if you know how these lists work, you can guess what they said third. Curriculum permeation. Now, I had an ed degree from the University of Regina. I had a doctorate in theology, and I didn't know what that meant. I said, that's interesting. I know what a curriculum is, and I know what the verb permeate means, but what is this? They said, well, in a Catholic school, it shouldn't just be a secular school, a secular public school, but with a religion class and a crucifix on the wall, but the approach to each subject area should be Catholic. The way you look at math or health or social studies should be approached from a Catholic point of view. And I said, well, that sounds like a great idea. Do you have like a textbook? Is there any, are there any resources that you would use if you want me to teach a course on this? And they said, no, there's not really anything. They weren't familiar with any resources. And so I went into this situation of teaching a class. If there's teachers among you, some of you may have experienced this where you're sort of 1 week ahead of the students. You're just sort of learning it as you go. Sometimes you're almost making it up sort of week by week because you hadn't done it before. But by the end of that class, we were all so excited. Me and the students felt like we had something. And that was the beginning of what eventually became the book, Educating for Eternity. Now, on the first day of class, before we went over the syllabus, before we did introductions or anything like that, I just wrote a question on the board. One question. I said, get out your pen and paper and write for 5 or 10 minutes and figure out what you think about this question by doing a bit of a free write. And the question I wrote was this: what are people for? And I hope that it caught them off guard a little bit, because it strikes me as the kind of question that when you see it, you think, well, I've never been asked that, and I don't have maybe a ready answer for it, but I feel like I should have something to say about it. Being one of those people, I should be able to give some account of myself and what I'm for. So the students wrote for 5 or 10 minutes, and then I asked them to share what they came up with, and they shared various things. And you can imagine some of the things they wrote, right? People are made for service. People are made for love. People are made for community. They wrote those kinds of things. None of them wrote, people are to make as much money as they can before they die. Nobody wrote that. But my guess is, if you were to ask the average person on the street, why should kids go to school? Their answer I would think probably 90+% of the time, the answer would be basically economic. It would be, you need certain skills to compete in a job market. You need to be ready for college. There's a global marketplace. It's highly competitive. And most of the way we as a culture talk about education is largely economic in terms. So I asked this question, what are people for, at the beginning of a class for prospective Catholic teachers, because every education presumes an anthropology. That is to say, every education presumes that people are made for some goal or set of goals that will satisfy them, that will make their life worthwhile. And none of us, when we're asked, say that the thing that will make your life worthwhile is money. But when we ask why we should go to school, most of our answers tend towards the economic. Now, I'm actually all for gainful employment. I do want our kids to have skills that can get them jobs and get them into college. That's great. But I also don't want to give them the impression that that's going to satisfy them in life. That if they achieve economic goals, everything else will be okay. And so I don't want an education that limits their horizons to the merely economic, even if I do hope it gives them marketable skills and other sorts of things. I don't want them to think that that's what their education is all about. I found this comic when I searched rat race, and I think it describes, can everyone read it from the back? Can you read the comic? I think it describes our situation, culturally speaking, pretty well. I also found a great quote that said, the thing about the rat race is, even if you win it, you're still a rat, which I thought, I mean, the point of the metaphor, right, is there's something less than human about just chasing after these economic goals for no other end except to chase more of them and more of them, hoping eventually it will make you happy. In our tradition, there's lots of good answers out there to this question, what are people for? My favorite, that double skip there. My favorite is from St. Augustine, who wrote, you have made us for yourself, O God, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And you already saw the preview of the next character I was going to put up there. What are we doing? Do we recognize this fellow? This is the great Canadian comic actor Jim Carrey. And Jim Carrey, for a little while, in the late 1990s, could not stop making money, right? He just made one blockbuster hit after another. He's one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood. He got to marry a supermodel. He was arguably the best in the world at what he did, right? And if you've followed Jim Carrey's career, you'll know in the last several years, he's actually become a pretty thoughtful commentator on the human condition. I would actually recommend some of his videos of him giving interviews, or even what's the award, when he receives an award and gives a talk. Very insightful. And Jim Carrey didn't say exactly what Augustine said, but he said something very interesting. He said, everyone should get rich and famous. Oh, I'm not good at working that button. I wonder if I can do it better. Apologize. And it's the setup for the thing, right? And that's when it doesn't work, right? Everyone should get rich and famous, because then they'd learn that that's not what makes you happy, right? He had all the money he could possibly ever use. He had all the worldly success. He had all the trappings, right? And he found out that wasn't enough. And Jim Carrey's story is not unique, right? It's repeated whether your success is in the arts or business or politics or sports. People work their whole lives to get to the top of the pile, and only some tiny percentage of them get there. And even when they do, they find out that that wasn't the answer to their life's question, right? I was talking to an aviation teacher in Leonardtown, Maryland, and he said Neil Armstrong, when he got home from the moon, went into a deep depression, right? This is the metaphorical peak of human achievement, right? You're the first man on the moon, and then you come home and you got the rest of your life in front of you. What are you going to do now? Like, you were on the moon. That's top that. Like, he didn't know what his life was about anymore. He had made it to the very top of the human pyramid, right? And he needed to find something more than that kind of achievement, as impressive as it is. And so in a Catholic school, we're going to study all the subjects, and we're going to learn things that have applicability in various, college applications or jobs or whatever else. But those things are never, we don't pursue them for their own sake, right? We don't, not the subjects, but those earthly goals. We have a broader picture in mind that makes sense of what we're doing. And so what we want to focus on a little more now is, what does this worldview about the human person have to do with how we teach this subject or that subject? This is a quote from the Congregation for Catholic Education, describing what the school board in Regina called curriculum permeation. People call it all kinds of different things. You don't have to call it that. The basic idea is just an approach to every subject that is a Catholic approach. And the congregation wrote, "The endeavor to interweave reason and faith, which has become the heart of individual subjects, makes for unity, articulation, and coordination, bringing forth within what is learnt in school a Christian vision of the world, of life, of culture, and of history." One of the difficulties with contemporary sort of standard issue education is if we imagine every little thing that we might study in this or that subject needs to prepare us for something in the world that is related to economics, something in the job market, we don't get presented with a coherent picture of the universe where we can make sense of ourselves and our life. We're presented with this skill or this data that you might or might not use depending on whether you go into this or that field. And you get a sort of disjointed image of the world, and you don't see how pieces fit together. And the proposal here is, if faith and reason are integrated at the heart of every subject, then you're not going to get, maybe some skills here that you might use and maybe some skills over here that your buddy might use, but rather you'll get a coherent picture of the world, right? The world, life, culture, and history. You'll have a sense of who you are and where you fit, whether or not you're going to work in that particular field. And so we'll zoom in just even more. The very beginning of that statement was, "The endeavor to interweave reason and faith has become the heart of individual subjects." And that's going to be the bulk of what I want to talk to you and tonight and talk to teachers tomorrow. I try to give them a picture of what it means to approach their subject from a Catholic point of view. Most of our teachers, of course, have been trained in not in Catholic education faculties, and even Catholic education faculties may or may not have taught them much in this direction. And so they might have this impression that they're teaching their subject from some neutral point of view, and it would be kind of weird, and they don't really understand what it would mean to approach their subject from a Catholic point of view. So we're going to dig in. We're going to dig into that. We might imagine that faith, is something you study in religion or theology class, and then reason you study in math or science class. And that's kind of an oversimplification. Of course, in theology class, you should keep your reason turned on, right? Theology is faith-seeking understanding. It's not faith without reason, but it's faith trying to make sense, right? And so you leave your reason turned on in theology class. But how do you leave your faith turned on in, for example, math class, right? Very often, this is the first question or even the first objection I get when I present this idea. Is like, well, but what about math, right? Because math is just 2 + 2 is 4, whether you affirm the resurrection or not. Math is just math, so what are you going to do with it? And so I'm going to put in a little time on math on the premise that if I can convince you about math, you'll come with me for the ride on some of the other ones, right? So here's a foundational premise. Foundational premise is, you're not actually teaching anything from a neutral point of view. The content, in a certain sense, might be neutral, right? What year was Canadian Confederation? What's 2 + 2? That content is kind of neutral, but you can ask certain questions that get underneath the content, like this one, for example. If a student were to ask, and students do ask this, right? Why should I study math? You can't give a neutral answer to that question, right? The purpose behind our activity tells us something really important. In fact, if a student asks you, why should I study math, they're actually asking you a different question in disguise. What they're really asking you is, what are people for? And particularly, what am I for, and what does math have to do with me? And so any answer we give to the question, why should I study math, will be interpreted by the student as an answer to the question about their life. What does math have to do with them? And what does math have to do with their life? So we can give a few different answers to that, right? You could say, well, you should study math to graduate. And that's true, you should. You also see how it's a very inadequate answer if the real question is, what are people for? It sounds something like, People are born into systems where other people who have more power than they do get to tell them what to do, and they have to jump through arbitrary hoops in order to get along in that system, right? That's what that sounds like. And students have a couple different responses to this kind of answer, right? Some of them say, I'm great at jumping through hoops, watch me go, right? And some of them will burn themselves out jumping through these hoops. They'll work like crazy in school and they'll get great marks, but if they don't know what it's all about and why it matters, they're going to burn themselves out, and they're going to find out that even if they're really good at school, that's not the answer to their life's question. That's one possible response to this. Another response, one for which I have real respect actually, is the student who says, I don't jump through your hoops. I need some sort of internal motivation. I need to understand why this really matters in my life. And it's by no means is it the kids who aren't good at math who won't jump through the hoops. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But it's kids who say, I resist something that feels so arbitrary and imposed. I need you to answer the question about meaning before I'm going to pour my life out for this, right? And I think they challenge us in a good way. They do deserve a better answer. We could do a little better than that, right? We could say you should study math to gain some marketable skills. Well, I was very grateful today when my airplane landed at Newark Airport, and whichever engineer designed that thing kept me alive, right? So I'm very happy to have people with marketable skills in math. My own son is thinking about becoming an engineer, right? 3 cheers for marketable skills, but notice, if you're not going to work in a math-related field, you just think, well, this doesn't apply to me. And even if you are going to work in a math-related field, you're still going to need a better answer to the question, what are people for, than, to get a job so you can afford a kitchen reno sometime before you retire, right? So we could do even a little better than this. We could say, well, you could be, we could zoom out and think about societal goods, right? If you're good at math, you could be a productive citizen. You could help your fellow, your community, your fellows, right? And we're Catholics, 3 cheers for the common good. We like that kind of thing, right? But again, doesn't have a lot of application for people who aren't going to work in those fields. And I do want us to be just a little cautious about how we use the language of productivity, because we live in a culture that finds it very easy to equate your value with your productivity, right? I'm from Canada. I don't know if you've heard the horror stories coming out of Canada. But one of the things that follows from equating people's value with productivity is a pretty casual approach to life and death once people aren't productive anymore, right? If you were a veteran of Canada's armed forces and you're having trouble getting a wheelchair ramp put in, you might phone Veterans Affairs and the government and say, could you help me get a wheelchair ramp put in? And they might say, well, we can't really help with that, but have you considered killing yourself? They actually did that. That's something that happened, right? And so, productivity is a good thing, but I just want us to be a little cautious to notice how language in our culture sometimes frames our value in terms of productivity, and I don't want us to give our kids the impression that their life is valuable in as much as they are productive. Does that make sense? All right, so in a Catholic school, by the way, none of these answers are wrong. They're actually all true, right? They're just inadequate. They're not enough for the human person. So in a Catholic school, I think we can do better, right? When we teach math, always in the background is going to be this sense of wonder at God's creation, right? I think it's Galileo who's supposed to have said math is the language with which God has written the universe, right? So here's a quote from Scripture: "You have arranged all things by measure and number and weight." And if you have this idea at the foundation of math, you can give some better answers. You could say something like, you have been created to know and love God and God's works, and math is a unique and powerful way to explore the beauty and order of creation. Whether or not you become an accountant or an engineer, right? You are a person who's made to encounter truth and beauty, and math is a great way to do it, whether you're really good at it or not really good at it, whether you're going to have a career in it or you're not going to have a career in it. I was talking to a math teacher in New Orleans who had a ready answer when students asked her, why should I study math? She said, because you can. I really like that answer. First of all, it's a lot easier to remember than the word salad that I just had on the screen. But I think it gets about 90% of what I was trying to say with that theological, tome in 3 words, because you can. Because what are you saying to a child if you say you should study math because you can? Look at you, you wonder of the universe, you. We don't know anything else in creation that encounters reality in this way. Think of something like a 3, right? You can't put it in your pocket. You could never find one in nature. But your 3-year-old can conceptualize the notion of 3-ness and work with it in their mind and recognize, if you take a cookie away, the difference between 4-ness and 3-ness, right? That's amazing, actually, that humans can do that. And we can do it to such a degree that we find that when we work in the spiritual realm, apart from any sort of physical reality that we can touch, you can't touch an equation or a number, but you can work with those things and you can put them back into reality, and you can put a rover on Mars. That's an amazing thing, and our kids should be taught to wonder not only at the beauty and order of the universe, which of course they should wonder at, but at the human vocation to encounter the created order in this way, that we can use math to do amazing things. And whether you're great at it or not, it's remarkable that you can. My kids, this is a wild thing. We were having pancakes one morning. Little kids. And the kid says, how many pieces of pancake can you make with how many slices of the knife, right? So this is watch how this goes. With 1 slice of the knife, how many pieces of pancake can you make? 2. That's easy. With 2 slices, and let's say they're straight slices, none of this weaving business, all right? 2 straight slices, how many pieces of pancake can you make? You can make as many as 4. You could make also 3, right, if you had parallel lines, but if they cross, you make 4. How many can you make if you make 3 slices? Is it 9? It gets hard fast once you start adding the numbers, right? We took about 90 minutes, and we found a formula for like n slices. And there's a formula that you can get the amount of pieces you can get. 90 minutes, little kids who were just interested in reality. They just wanted to figure this out. Then we looked it up on the internet and found out it's actually called the pancake problem. It's a real thing. Check it out. It might be fun with your kids. But notice, teach the kids not that math is useful if and when you become an engineer, but that you are a wonder of the universe because you can ask the kinds of questions and discover the kind of things through math that nothing else we've ever met can do, right? You could say something like, you are endowed by God with will and intellect, and you've been tasked with the stewardship of creation, and that includes developing the remarkable potential that God has built into creation. Now, this is getting a little bit towards the marketable skills and the productive citizenship, right? It can cash out in certain products or things you might do, but notice the framework is so different, right? It's not about whether you can make money or not, but it's about your vocation before God, right? When we make retirement plans and railway bridges and rocket ships, we're building potential that God has put into creation, building it out for our good and even beyond the human good, right? The good of all living things even. We could answer another thing. We could say, I don't know why it does that some of the time. There we go. We could say, humans are built for truth, and studying math is a great way to learn to pursue and love the truth. Teachers know when they get students working on a math problem and the students forget the all-important question in math class. What's the all-important question in math class? Will this be on the test, right? When I say that to teachers, the whole room goes, on the test, because they all know, right? If students have forgotten that, if they've forgotten the drama that's happening on social media, if they don't know what time the bell's going to ring, but they're just invested in solving the problem because they want to know the true answer, when that happens, you can teach them you're built for this, right? You want to know true things. And when you encounter truth, you automatically love it. And the beautiful thing about math, there's truth available, of course, in literature and history and health. There's truth available in all the subjects, or we shouldn't teach them. But the beautiful thing about truth in math is it's so self-evident, it's its own argument. When you see it, you can't unsee it. I've had teachers tell me when they first present the idea of irrational numbers to students, the students are like, well, that can't be right. Like, that can't be a thing. You can't have irrational numbers. And it takes something like 10 minutes to demonstrate that you can. And once you see it, you just see it. Like, there's not arguments for weeks after the fact, like, come on, why are we doing this? This isn't a real thing. No, like, once you see it, it's just there, right? There's this sort of beauty of comprehension of truth. I was talking to a teacher who was teaching in a Catholic school by day and doing her master's degree at a secular university by night. And she said at that university, everything they studied was deconstruction. It was taking apart all the ideas and stories and narratives that you would use to make sense of your life and making them problematic and putting them into question. And she said she would get home from her grad school just morally and spiritually exhausted. And so to revive her soul, late on a Thursday night, she would do Sudoku puzzles. Because it's really hard to deconstruct a Sudoku puzzle, right? The 9 either fits in that square or it doesn't fit in that square. And to be able to encounter truth in a way that it couldn't be problematized, but that it could just be self-evidently true and you could rest in that, was something that satisfied her soul. And our students need to learn that relationship between their own desire and truth. And math is a great place to develop their capacity and their recognition of that. And the last reason, I think this is a great reason why you should study math, actually. You should study math for fun. The pancake problem, like, we were having a blast. If something is fun, it tells you that there's something in you that is being satisfied that was built for this kind of thing, right? It says something. In fact, that doesn't mean it's not ever hard work, right? Hard work can actually be fun. But it tells you something about satisfying your own soul and what you're made for. So I hope at this stage, if someone were to ask you, can you teach math from a Catholic point of view, you might feel some confidence to be able to answer that. Notice, I think the reason people initially would resist the idea, or at least be suspicious or questioning of the idea that you could teach math from a Catholic point of view, is because I think the first place our imagination goes when we think about teaching everything from a Catholic point of view is to add some Catholic content, right? So in music or art or literature, there's just Catholic stuff all over the place. There's no shortage of Catholic things you could add in those classes, or history or social studies for that matter. But in math, we think like, well, that feels really awkward, right? So 2 nuns from Montana are driving 80 miles an hour, and they get to Saskatchewan, and now it's kilometers per hour, and, like purgatory and Hail Marys, and, you can make Catholic math problems. But that's not what we're talking about. And in fact, if you overplay that hand, you might just build resentment in your audience, right? They might feel like this is a little artificial. But that's not really what we're talking. We're not talking about arbitrarily adding sort of Catholic content that doesn't really fit. We're talking about a worldview within which we can make sense of math and what it has to do with me and my life, right? Now, we're going to look at a few other subjects a little quicker than we looked at math. But notice that the relationship between content and context is a little different, right? So you know what I mean by content. Context is what I tried to do with math, right? Give you a Catholic context. And my argument is going to be, even if you have a subject like literature, where you could study Catholic stuff all day long, you should still not be content to just add Catholic content. you should still think about language arts and literature from a Catholic point of view. And by the way, Catholics don't just read Catholic books, right? We expect to find truth and goodness and beauty in the literary heritage of the world, and we read all kinds of great books, whether they're Catholic or not. But we expect in literature to find truth somehow, right? So what's a Catholic approach to literature? I read The Hobbit I didn't even go to Catholic school. I went to public school and we read The Hobbit. No one told us that The Hobbit was a Catholic novel. It was just one of the great novels of our literary tradition, and so we read it. You could read Catholic novels all day and never run out of them. But how might we think about language arts and literature from a Catholic point of view? Why don't we start with the fact that God gave us a book, right? That seems almost too obvious, but what's the implication if God gives us a book, right? Well, it means that God believes in the power of language to communicate the truth. If you've gone to a university in the last 30, 40 years, you know that you can't just straightforwardly assume this, right? If you go to an English department, they might tell you that language actually can never really attain to truth. Words can only ever point at other words, but none of them can ever really get at the thing. And so we're just left with people who are better at using words than other people are, and they can use those words to coerce and manipulate people to get their way. And language is really not related to truth. It's basically just a function of power. Now you have an English degree. I have friends who've gone through English degrees, and that's a lot of what they hear, right? That's not completely wrong, because it's true that you can misuse language to do that, right? You can misuse it. But the question is, can it be used well? Can you use language to actually know and understand and share and communicate true things? Well, if God gives us a Bible, then God thinks so, right? And so it shouldn't be a surprise that a Catholic literary imagination flourishes and that we produce so much great literary work if we come from a tradition that believes in the power of language. Not only the existence of the Bible speaks to that, but the content of the Bible talks about language a lot. In the beginning was we take that for granted, but think about what it means that the language is the Bible's preferred metaphor for God's relationship in God's self is language, right? We'll talk a little bit more about that going forward. I want to talk now about the creation story. Words create worlds, right? In the creation story in Genesis, God speaks and things come into being. Now, this is not arbitrary. If you think about your own life, there are words in your head that you can summon right now. Someone said something to you 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and you know exactly. Maybe it was 4 or 5 words, but you know exactly what they said. And as long as you remember anything, you will remember those words. Now, why is that? Because words are foundational for our self-understanding and our identity, right? What we are told, particularly by the people who love us and are responsible for us when we're little, becomes foundational. Hopefully for the good, sometimes not for the good, and sometimes we have to struggle with that, sometimes for the rest of our lives, right? But words shape our reality. Old Testament scholars will tell us we understand the Genesis narrative better if we understand the historical context in which it was written. The Jews at the time when they put Genesis in its final form as we have it today were in captivity in Babylon. And so imagine this, right? Your kid, you and your family and your neighbors are taken away from your culture, and you have to raise your kids in a foreign culture, and that culture has very different stories about the world and what matters, and you need to be able to preserve your own sense of reality and pass it on to your children in the face of this other story, right? Now, maybe that's actually a metaphor for Catholic schools in contemporary culture, right? Tell a better story than the Babylonians wouldn't be a bad tagline. You know, St. Mary's School, telling a better story than the Babylonians since 19 whatever. The Babylonian story was Marduk, the great god king of Babylon, had created human beings in primeval combat with the chaos dragon of the deep, Tiamat. He slew her, split her down the middle with his great sword, and from her entrails made human beings as slaves to the gods, right? Notice that's another answer to our first question, right? What are people for? Your dragon guts, slaves to the gods, right? And we might say, well, yeah, Bronze Age mythology, people don't believe stuff like that anymore. I don't know. Do you think there's people in our culture who feel like there are powers greater than them that can coerce them and force them to work till they die and don't have their best interests at heart? That human experience isn't that different. We'll use different metaphors to describe it, but you can see what the Babylonians were talking about, right? And the Jews said, no, that's not what we were made for. Our story is different, right? Our God doesn't create with the sword. Our God and doesn't make us slaves. Our God creates with the word and makes us in his image and likeness. Notice the difference between how swords work and how words work, right? If the sword is the primary creative power, then God has coercive power over you, and you have to do what you're told. It works really well with the slave identity, right? If God creates with words, he can create you free in his image and likeness. Parents, you know this when you're at your very best. You have the words not to overpower your children, but to free your children, right? Let's say your children are bickering. You can say, stop bickering, and they might. But they'll probably be a little bit resentful, and it'll simmer on the side, and when you turn your back, it might start again, right? And you can overrule them, and you can tell them what to do, and you can threaten them with consequences because you're bigger and stronger. The long-term consequence of that is not going to be well-adjusted, free, happy kids who can do the right thing when they want to do the right thing. It will be more often like looking over your shoulder, finding out what I can get away with, that kind of thing, right? But when you're at your best, when they're bickering, you can come up with some creative thing to get them to see the situation differently so they can freely choose the good, right? I have plenty of bad moments. I've done the yell at them and tell them to stop doing what they're doing, right? Just like probably all of us have. But the other day, they were bickering at the table, and Mama was upstairs, and I had to get out the door, and I needed them to stop fighting so I could leave, and I didn't want to leave them, for Mom to deal with. And I had the flash of insight, and instead of saying, stop it, I have to go, I'm going to be late for work, and you guys need to smarten up, I said, children, I tell all my friends how good you are. What am I supposed to tell them now? And they stopped. It caught them off guard, right? And it gave them, I didn't yell at them or tell them what to do. I just gave them enough critical distance from their behavior that they could see it with their own eyes. And then they would, and in fact, they didn't even have the heart to fight after that, Martha, the youngest one, she was still feeling a little resentful at this point, and she got the best answer of all of them. She said, tell them we're normal. But you see how words, well used, can free people. Father, you hear confessions. That's your job, is to free people with words, right? And this is the image that the Bible gives us of God, right? There's Martha in the middle, overposing, because as you can tell, she's got no shortage of personality. And those are the rest of them, the 7. You'll see there's 4 little girls there. Those 4 little girls love making cards. We're an hour ahead of them, so it's only 6:30 in Saskatchewan. They might be making cards right now. When I get home, there might be cards on my pillow. Dad, this is Beatrice. You are nice. Thanks, B. She's the one on the far end here. You see the 2 teenage boys in the soccer jerseys there? They're not making cards. I'll guarantee it. But twice a year, Mama says, you got to make cards. On Father's Day and on Dad's birthday, everyone has to make a card. 8.5 by 11, fold it in half. You got to put everything on it yourself, right? And Toby, the taller one holding the trophy there, 3 or 4 years ago for Father's Day, Toby wrote 4 words inside of a card. And as long as I live, as long as I remember anything, I will remember those 4 words. And they weren't, "I love you, Dad." If you guys have teenage sons, if you can get them to say, "I love you, Dad," more, I'm open for tips. Oscar says it more than Toby. But anyways, Toby didn't say that. He said, "You give me confidence." Right? Here's the kicker. If I actually managed to do that, if I gave a 13-year-old boy confidence, what's the number one tool in my toolkit? Language, right? Now, we all know if your words aren't matched by your actions, they're not worth much. So it's not words in isolation. It's words in relationship, words that can be relied on, words that you can count on. But how do you talk to a kid when he gets the game-winning hit? How do you talk to a kid when he gets the game-losing error, right? How do you talk to a kid when the girl he likes him? How do you talk to a kid when the girl he likes somebody else, right? How do you talk to a kid when he's a great big brother? And how do you talk to a kid when he's a miserable big brother? Because he's going to do all those things at some point, right? How you talk to people in all of those situations, especially parents, but also teachers, how you talk to kids goes so deep into shaping their sense of whether they can make it in the world, right? Confidence gets shaped by those kinds of things. So the incredible power of words is something in a Catholic school and a Catholic worldview we're utterly committed to. In addition to words, of course, stories are incredibly powerful. That's why I just told one. When God became man, if the Gospels are to be relied upon, he spent most of his time telling stories, right? He healed some people, he cast out some demons, but even when he was doing that, he was telling stories to make sure you didn't miss the point, right? Isn't that fascinating? God had like 3 years of public ministry, mostly storytelling, right? Why? Because stories are at the foundation of how we make sense of ourselves in the world. That's why you should start reading to kids maybe before they're born, right? Read them stories after stories after stories. That's why every culture has stories that you give to children, right? We make sense of the world through narrative, right? So stories and language. What about grammar? Can you teach grammar from a Catholic point of view? You know what my answer is going to be, right? But how am I going to say this, right? Who's the character in the picture? Do we recognize him? That's Friedrich Nietzsche. For my money, the best atheist philosopher of them all. It doesn't mean he's right, but he sure is interesting. And he says a lot of really penetrating things. And one of the things he says, which I think is fascinating, which I would love it if a Catholic English teacher in high school would just put this on the wall and leave it there for a few months and then write me an email to tell me what reaction it got. We are not rid of God. We still believe in grammar. What is he talking about? Right? I'd love to see, put that on the wall and then see what conversations emerge from the kids without you directing them. But the group that they call the New Atheists, right? Their argument against God is something like, we didn't used to understand certain naturalistic phenomena like, thunderstorms and earthquakes, so we invented God to explain thunderstorms and earthquakes, but now we understand thunderstorms and earthquakes from a naturalistic point of view, and so we don't need God anymore. Now, this is actually a very silly argument because nowhere in the history of arguments for God, Thomas Aquinas doesn't say, we don't understand thunderstorms, therefore God. Like, it's just not a thing that anyone has argued. So to imagine that reversing it gets rid of God is a little bit silly. But Nietzsche has a much more interesting argument. Nietzsche figures, if there's something outside of myself that is greater than I am and to which I am responsible, then I can't be fully and freely Friedrich Nietzsche. I should be able to assert myself as much, which is why he comes up with terrible things like the strong should oppress the weak if they can, right? He hates Christianity. He calls it a slave religion, right? Because it lifts up the lowly. And he thinks, no, you shouldn't. You should trample them if you can do it. The strong man should just overpower. Well, what's grammar? It's a set of rules that you're responsible to. And Nietzsche doesn't like that at all. It's something like God. It's something outside himself that he doesn't have control over, that he has to be responsible to, right? But is he right that grammar, or for that matter, that rules in general are some sort of opposition to our freedom, right? He wants maximized freedom, so he wants minimized rules, and grammar are rules. Do you know when the Jews got the 10 Commandments? Right after they got out of Egypt, right? Right after they were set free from the political slavery, right? Once the empire didn't control them anymore, now they're living on their own in the desert, and God gives them the 10 Commandments, and the Bible is explicit on this point, in order to keep them free. If you have these good rules and you follow them, you will remain free, because people who lie and cheat and steal and covet their neighbor's donkeys are not free people, right? And so the Jewish and the biblical understanding is not that rules are opposed to freedom, but that good rules, at least, good rules are the scaffolding for freedom, right? And we see that if we reflect on how grammar works. I am free to communicate my ideas to you, and I'm more free the better command I have of grammar. If I have a weak command of grammar, my ideas are going to get scrambled somewhere between my head and your ears, right? And the same thing is going to happen in a whole other, range of things, right? If you want to play a musical instrument, right? I could go up and hit any keys on the piano in any duration and in any combination with no external coercion. The government's not telling me which keys I can hit and when. But it's going to sound awful, and pretty soon you're all going to start to leave the room. But there might be someone here who's taken the rules, the scales, and all the other points about musical composition and whatever else into their very selves. It comes out their fingers, and when they sit down to play something, people will start coming in, right? They know the rules better than I do, and they live by the rules better than I do, and they're more free on that keyboard than I am. The same thing is true in a basketball game, right? Who do you want taking the shot when the game's on the line? Someone who's theoretically free to throw that ball however they want, or someone who's taken the shot 10,000 times in practice and understands the biomechanics and the clock and the psychology and all the other things that are limiting factors in a certain sense, but once you know them and understand them and live them in your body, you are free, right? This is why Michael Jordan makes one of the most famous shots of all time with his eyes closed. That's a picture of a free man. I don't even need to look at it, right? Because he's got it in his bones, right? So, grammar is an opportunity even to reflect on the relationship between rules and freedom. We'll go a little quicker through the next few here. Science, what kind of Catholic context is there for science? I'm going to say it's very similar to math, so we won't do a long bit on it. But it's two sides of a coin, right? On the one hand, the beauty and order of creation, and on the other hand, the human vocation of stewardship within that creation, right? And always, no matter what we're teaching, that's a foundation for us as we approach it. Here's a beautiful quote, and there's no shortage, by the way, of quotes from scientists. And this is from a Catholic scientist. There's great quotes from atheist and agnostic scientists that are borderline mystical. Servant of God Enrico Medi, who was an astrophysicist, wrote, "O you mysterious galaxies, I see you, I calculate you, I understand you. I study you and I discover you. I penetrate you and I gather you. From you I take light and make it knowledge. I take movement and make it wisdom. I take sparkling colors and make them poetry. I take you stars in my hands, and trembling in the oneness of my being, I raise you above yourselves and offer you in prayer to the Creator, that through me alone you stars can worship." Not only does he have an incredible sense of the beauty and order of creation, he also has this incredible sense of his role as a scientist. He imagines doing science as an act of worship. Through his study of the stars, he's bringing the cosmos into an act of worship and offering it up to God, right? What a beautiful way to think of the human vocation of stewardship. When we learn about and care for the creation, it's an act of worship. What kind of Catholic content can we find in science? Well, I'm going to say yes and no to this one, right? Photosynthesis is kind of like 2 + 2. It works whether or not you affirm the resurrection. I won't say whether or not the resurrection happened. That's a more interesting question. But it does work whether or not you affirm the resurrection, right? So there's some things like there's formulas and stuff that are just, they're not specifically Catholic, except in as much as they're pursuing the truth, and that's Catholic, right? But within science, there's what we might call science-adjacent things that are appropriate to study in science class. Something like the history of the scientific method. Where does it come from? It doesn't emerge out of nowhere. It emerges in a cultural context where people believed certain things about the nature of the universe, right? It was theological arguments about the rightful independence of the material order that were made by medieval theologians that undergirded the development of something like the scientific method. So you could rightly study the history or the philosophy of science. You could also do this in cross-curricular ways, right? You could do this with the history teacher or the theology teacher and look at some of those developments. Science is also great for providing analogies. A quick word about analogies. Because truth is one, right? This doesn't work if truth isn't one. Because truth is one, things in one domain can lend their intelligibility to another domain. Any computer programmers in the room? Right? None. Okay. Should find a different example, but I'm going to stick with that one. Okay. Philosophers had been doing logic for centuries before anyone invented a computer, but you need logic for computer programming, right? You want to do physics, you're going to need the intelligibility from math, right? So analogies work this way, and great storytellers and teachers and preachers, they use analogies all the time, right? Jesus is the master here. To what shall I compare the kingdom of God? He's like, I need to find a good analogy. What shall I do, right? And in order to talk about spiritual realities, Jesus uses analogies from science all the time. What's Jesus' favorite science? Horticulture, right? Like every second story is about plants and seeds and soil, right? He dabbles a little in meteorology, right? Because he's talking to fishermen and farmers, people who know how to watch the sky, right? So he talks about these things. A physics teacher told me Newton's third law, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, right? Is not a bad analogy for thinking about decisions in the moral life, actually, right? So we can use analogies from science as well. Now, if you're wondering, okay, this all sounds highly theoretical, maybe you can do this in high school. Can you do it in elementary school? How do you do this with the littles? This is my daughter, Dorothy. Dorothy loves to color. Loves to color. She will color all day if you let her. When Dorothy was about 6 years old, we're expecting Martha, our 7th child, right? So Dorothy comes up to me, as 6-year-olds will, and says, Dad, you and Mom make babies, right? Yes, Dorothy. Yes, we do. Tough to deny at that point. So she says, but I thought God made babies. Well, yes, Dorothy, that's true as well. How does that work? Okay, right? Now notice that Dorothy's question about where babies come from and whether there's a naturalistic explanation and what that has to do with there being a God explanation is the same question that your middle schoolers and your high schools have about evolution and the Big Bang. It's the same problem, right? If we understand the scientific naturalistic explanation, what does that mean about God, right? But she's asking it about human procreation. So I said to her, well, bring me something you colored. So she brings me a piece of paper that she's colored. And I said, Dorothy, was this colored by a marker? And she says, yeah, it was colored by a marker. And I said, but I thought you colored it. Now I'm ready. I've got Thomas Aquinas in my back pocket. We're going to talk about primary and secondary causality and how higher order causes can transcend lower order causes without interfering with their proper functioning or freedom, right? And I don't have to say anything because it doesn't take 2 seconds and Dorothy says, oh, I get it, right? And I'm confident she gets it to such a degree that she wouldn't make a mistake like saying, I colored half of it and the marker colored half of it. She wouldn't even say that. She actually knew the marker at its own proper level colored all of it. There's not a bit of color on that wasn't marker. And she also knows that at her own proper level, which transcends the marker, she colored 100% of it. She couldn't say it that way, but she wouldn't make the mistake of saying half and half. She understood that these two things weren't in competition. And then she understood that mom and dad can make a baby and there can be a natural explanation and a natural mechanism that's understandable. And that doesn't mean that God doesn't play God's role in the creation of new life, right? And if you can do that with crayons and paper when you're 6 years old, you can actually set kids up so that when they find out about evolution in grade 8 or 9, it's not a big problem because they haven't been taught to think that God's in competition with the natural explanations in the world, right? Let's think a little bit about art, which I call the inverse of math. We might think about math as on this end of a spectrum, it's very objective. Art we might think of in some cases as very subjective, and they often are portrayed as quite different kinds of things. I think one of the things that makes them really interesting is both of them are things that only humans do, right? We don't know anyone else that does math, and we don't know anyone else that does art. If you find some art in a cave in southern France, and it's like a stylized painting of a horse on a hunt, no one is like, I wonder if the horses were in here doing some portraiture, right? Like, almost by definition, if you find art, it was the humans, right? So how does that make it the inverse of math? Well, remember when I said, you little math doer, you can look at 3 trees or 3 cookies or 3 ducks, and from that, you can abstract to this idea of threeness, right? You're moving from the material order into the spiritual order when you do math. Art goes the other way. Art starts in the spiritual realm and moves into the physical. And the reason it's humans that do either of those things is because humans are the one thing we've met that have bodies and rational souls, right? We live in the material order, but we also live in the spiritual order. And both math and art are involving both of those, but looking from the other direction. In art, you take something, some idea, some feeling, some notion, and you want to share it with somebody. And if you want to get it across to them, you have to give it some body in the world. You got to carve a piece of marble, or you got to spread some oil on some canvas, or at minimum, you just got to shape the airwaves in a room by moving your tongue and your lips and putting some air through a voice box, right? But you shape some element of material reality to share something that's in you with your audience. By the way, that's also the doctrine of the incarnation, right? God is spirit. God is not physical. God is not in the material order. But when God wants to communicate God's self to his audience in a way that they can receive it, God becomes flesh and dwells among us, right? And so this idea of God as artist is all over our tradition. The incarnation is sort of God's great masterpiece. But before that, of course, there's all of creation. We see God doing different art throughout Scripture, right? The very first art we see God doing is gardening. Explains why Jesus is so into horticulture, right? God is the gardener. In John's Gospel, when Mary Magdalene meets Jesus after the resurrection and doesn't recognize him right away, who does she mistake him for? The gardener. John's being a little cheeky with us there, right? Because he actually is the gardener. That's part of the point, right? He's the creator who is imaged in Genesis as making a garden. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote, come on. Oh, you don't see the weird pop-up that I get when I can't move my thing. There we go. There it is. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote a beautiful essay called On Fairy Stories. Has anyone heard of On Fairy Stories? If you're interested in art or literature, I highly recommend to you On Fairy Stories. And in it, he talks about humans as sub-creators. And he says, look, if you are made in the image and likeness of a creator, then you yourself are a creator. And art teachers will tell me, they have these breakthroughs with students that can happen in art class, right? The student who's struggling, maybe there's trouble at home, maybe there's bullying issues, who knows what's going on social media. They've kind of closed off into themselves, and maybe they don't talk a lot, but they produce something in art class, and the teacher recognizes something in them and says, hey, that's really great. Why don't you tell me more about that? Or what does that mean? Or just a little glimpse of recognition when someone sees something of who you are and something you've created in art, and those kids can come alive. And when that happens, an art teacher who knows their Catholic tradition can say, that's because you're built for this. God made you as a creator because you are in his image and he is a creator. You're doing something that you're made for, right? And they can come alive in a way that they weren't finding any other place. Art is about self-expression, but I think our culture can screw this part up a little bit. Our culture can make self-expression a kind of self-assertion, just put your stamp out there, even if, and this is where you get really terrible art, even if it's like, show the world how incomprehensible you are, right? You are so cool that no one will ever get you, right? If you've ever looked at art and been like, what is that, right? Now, sometimes you have to work a little hard. I don't want to say that all art should come to you easily. Sometimes you should sit with it and let it work on you. But sometimes it's garbage. And it doesn't matter how long you look at it, you're not going to get anything out of it. And very often, that's someone who has been taught that art is about a kind of assertion of themselves onto reality. And what we know about the mental health of artists who pursue that, they don't have a good track record. It's not good for you. Because what we're really meant to do when we express ourselves, self-expression isn't about self-assertion. Self-expression is about an offering that is meant to be received. And that happens when you make a piece of art that you can share something of yourself and someone else can say, I see you, I know what you're about, I receive that, and now there is a bond between us. There is a kind of communion. Notice, I just described the doctrine of the Trinity. Right? God's self-expression is the Word, and that is given and then received, and that is so perfect that communion becomes a third person. That's what we're trying to do. We're made in God's image, and we're trying to offer ourselves to be received so as to create communion. And art is a place where we can share very often the deepest things in us, and we long more than anything to be seen and heard and understood there, right? Have you ever had this experience? Have you ever seen something really beautiful? A sunset, a new baby, or heard a beautiful piece of music, and instead of feeling satisfied, you just feel like more longing? Beauty is funny that way, right? Beauty, you would think because we pursue beauty, when we find it, we would be satisfied by it. But instead, when we find beauty, it intensifies our longing for more beauty. It's the opposite of cheesecake, right? You can pursue cheesecake, and you can achieve cheesecake, and then when you've had enough cheesecake, you know that you've had enough cheesecake, right? But you can't get too much beauty. You can't get like, oh, there's so much sunset, I can't take it anymore. No, like you will keep staring at this beautiful thing. C.S. Lewis says, if you encounter in yourself a desire that can't be fulfilled in this world, it might be a sign that you're made for something more than this world, right? The beauty in creation that we encounter is never enough because it's pointing to something beyond, right? It induces a kind of longing in us, which is why in art, humans pursue that longing for the infinite that we all have, right? And so here's a quote from John Paul II's letter to artists. And by the way, I recommend this to you too. It's not that long, John Paul's letter to artists. And even bright high schoolers could read it. John Paul II says, even beyond its typically religious expressions, true art has a close affinity with the world of faith, so that even in situations where culture and the church are far apart, art remains a kind of bridge to religious experience, right? Of course, in a Catholic school, we're going to study some sacred art. We're going to know something about the Catholic artistic tradition, but we don't actually pretend that that's the only art that's worthy of study, right? We think that humans pursue goodness and truth and beauty through art, and doggone it, sometimes they find it, and it's worth engaging in not only the artistic heritage of the world, which is full of great treasures, but even contemporary art and even pop culture is worth investigating with the right lenses on, because everywhere people are trying to say who they are and what matters to them and what their deepest longings are, right? So we've come to the sing-along. Are you guys ready for a sing-along? Been sitting silent for a while, so we're going to sing a little together. It's only one line. Don't worry, you'll be fine. The sing-along portion of the night. So I'm going to sing the first line of a chorus, and you're going to sing the second line back to me. And I don't have to put the lyrics on the screen. I don't have to tell you what song it is, because you all know the song already, all right? You enthusiastic singers? Okay. Take me down to the Paradise City. Oh, yes, there it is. I always wait for that line. I know someone is with me when they're going to go for that one. Check out this image, right? Even in situations where culture and the church are far apart. What's that image? It's a cross. It's a cross with grinning skulls on it. It's the cover of Appetite for Destruction, the album of the song that we just sang, right? That song, by the way, I'm sorry to inform you, is almost 40 years old. So that's how old we are. I know. It's tough. But even though that song is almost 40 years old, I can sing it in any gym or church or auditorium in North America, and I will get 90+% participation. Why do we all know that song, right? It's a great song because Axl Rose managed to tap into something about the human desire, right? If you listen to the song, it's beautiful. The beginning is so beautiful. These sort of the slow build and the layers of the guitars and then the vocals and the harmonies, right? And it's this sort of soaring anthemic kind of thing going on. And then what happens next? Someone blows a whistle, right? A really harsh whistle. And the guitar switches over to these grungy sort of power chords, and the vocals stop being these beautiful harmonies and instead become this angry sort of guttural growl, and the words, which were beautiful, now get ugly. And the song goes back and forth between these angry, ugly verses and this soaring anthemic chorus, right? And Axl Rose is telling you a story about the difference between life as he's living it and life as he knows it should be, right? He's talking about his own longing. It's very explicit. The language in the chorus is like, I'm living on the street, and it's smoky, and it's dangerous, and there's violence, right? And then take me someplace beautiful and simple where I can feel safe and at home, right? And then by the end, he's frantic, right? The oh, won't you please take me home starts repeating itself faster and faster and faster. And the outro is like double speed, and it's like, right? But he in that song, he doesn't find what he's looking for, but he sure tells you a lot about his desire, right? And on an album whose cover art is borderline sacrilegious, he doesn't even pretend not to use religious language, right? What's the name of the song? We almost don't even notice he's using religious language, but it's called Paradise City, right? So as Catholics, of course, we're going to study the beautiful things in our own heritage, but we're also going to give our kids the tools to recognize the human desire that is being sought in all kinds of art, sometimes in confused and disordered ways. Here's the thing. We don't get to pick everything they listen to, do we? So when they bring something to you, you can say, okay, what's the good that's being sought here, right? Might be disordered, might be confused, but there's some real good that someone is trying to chase down. Do you know the line, even the man who knocks on the door of a brothel is looking for God, right? No one's looking for evil for its own sake, right? You're looking for some good, and we can give them those lenses. Last subject for tonight, health. I don't know if you saw the studies came out, very disappointing studies recently. Smoking is just as bad for Catholics as it is for everyone else. It's a bummer, I know. My point, of course, is diet, exercise, substances, sleep, your relationship with your phone. Good advice on that in a public school is pretty good advice on that in a Catholic school. A lot of the content is going to be the same. But we can ask some other kinds of questions in a Catholic health class. What about a question like this? What kind of a good is health? I think our culture doesn't ask that question very much. I think our culture presumes an answer to that. I think our culture presumes that health is the highest good. And we often talk about it as if it's the highest good, right? If you've had children, you know this line, right? First question, is it a boy or a girl? There's no wrong answer, right? We'll celebrate with you either way. Hooray! And then the follow-up. Doesn't matter as long as it's healthy, right? Now, I will take health for your child and for mine 100 times out of 100, given the choice, but sometimes they're not. And I don't know if we think about what it means when we say that the other things don't matter as long as they're healthy. I had a friend, when we were living in student family housing in Toronto, we had Toby and Oscar, they were little boys. We had friends who had two little girls, almost the same age. The second little girl was born with a hearing problem. So the mom was talking, you got to go in because they put the tubes in, right? But they grow so fast that pretty soon the tubes are too small, so they start falling out. So you got to go get fitted for new tubes every couple of weeks when they're really little. It's a real pain, right? So the mom is talking about this. They got to go in and get all this work done or whatever. And one of the other moms in the group says to her, well, they test for that, Right? She could have got a test done while the baby was in utero, found out she was defective, and maybe had a better baby, right? I don't think that mom meant to say something horrific. But she lives in a culture that puts health at such a high good that she can sort of unconsciously talk about a little girl who is right there in her mother's arms as if her life is worth less because she's got a hearing problem, right? And people have a lot bigger problems than hearing problems, right? And so I talked earlier about, being careful about productivity. I would also be careful about how we talk about health as the highest good. Because what percentage of our kids are going to get sick? We hope 100%, right? We hope everyone lives long enough to get sick, right? And so we need to be able to give better answers to those kinds of questions. Health is a great good. It's worth a lot of your time and effort. Your health, your family's health, your community's health. But it's a terrible God, right? No one's getting out of here alive. If you worship at that altar, it's going to let you down eventually. And so we have to be able to answer questions like, can I live well if I'm not healthy? What would it look like in a Catholic high school if you brought in someone from the community who's dealing with a chronic or a terminal illness to talk to the kids about what it's like to live with that and to find meaning in their life, right? I don't say this flippantly. I lost a little brother to cancer, so this is not a flippant thing, but sometimes people find meaning, deep meaning for the first time when they're faced with a health crisis. Sometimes people get a sense of clarity and perspective on life that they didn't have before, right? We have to give people that possibility. We can't let them believe that if a health crisis comes, all of a sudden their possibility for a meaningful life is over, because it's coming, right? We got to give them something more, and in a Catholic school, we're privileged to be able to do that. A last thing about health, we can think about practices, right? Health is associated with practices, right? Exercise, diet, sleep, all that kind of stuff. But of course, we have practices for our spiritual health as well, right? Prayer, service, the sacraments, community, fellowship. What would it look like? Well, here's one of our practices, fasting, right? Now, it's having a bit of a moment culturally. You may have noticed people talking about fasting from a physical health point of view, right? And that's fine. But of course, we have a tradition of thinking about fasting from the point of view of spiritual health. What's the basic logic, the spiritual logic of fasting? Something like take enough critical distance from something that you can evaluate whether it's serving you well in your life or not. Right? It's interesting that at Lent, we typically don't give up evil things, right? We typically give up like things that are good or neutral, right? You might give up television, or you might give up a certain kind of food or desserts or something like that. Now, you could give up something evil, right? You could give up gossip for Lent, but then you don't get to start again at Easter, right? You don't be like, oh, just wait till they hear from me. Like, I got 6 weeks bottled up, right? And as a bonus, after 6 weeks of taking a break from whatever it is, you've built 6 weeks worth of discipline. So if you want to make a change, you have some wherewithal to put that in your life, right? Well, you see the picture I chose, of course. For many of our young people, the most important fast they could have is a fast from their phones. I think it would be a really fascinating assignment to say, well, now maybe their phones aren't here during the day. Tell me how this would work, Mr. Palmer. What if one Friday they brought their phones to school because the phones are staying here all weekend? Now, you got to hire some extra security, right, for that weekend. Yeah. So I got this idea. There was a girls' school in New Orleans. The girls went on retreat for the weekend. It was Friday afternoon. They all had to turn in their phones. On Sunday afternoon, they're leaving the retreat. They're giving them their phones back. Small handful of the girls said, no thanks, you keep it. They had 48 hours of freedom, and they realized it was something that they liked, right? What would it be like if our kids had 48 hours without their phones and had to reflect on what that was like? Journal, come to class, talk about it, share. What is your life like? What do you do with your time? Right? How did you feel when you went to reach for it and it wasn't there? Did you start chewing your nails? Did you need a cigarette? Like how did you, right? Okay, so those are, I hope those are helpful to think about how we can approach every subject from a Catholic point of view. I want to go really quick through a couple of questions. I think they're legitimate questions that people might ask about this, and I think we need to have good answers for them, right? If you say, my kid's going to school where they teach everything from a Catholic point of view, a lot of people are going to think you're indoctrinating them, right? And so is this kind of thing indoctrination? Well, one cheeky answer is, if you do it wrong, you could do it poorly. And by the way, it's not just a Catholic point of view that can be done that way, right? You can do, over at the public school, that whatever they're teaching there isn't neutral either, right? They might pretend it is, but it's not. They're making claims about the human person and what's valuable and what matters, right? Here's a few considerations. First, we're proposing a worldview. You can't really impose a worldview. You can try. It usually doesn't work. You usually build up resentment in your audience. I don't know if you've seen these studies that are coming out lately. Lots of corporations are hiring like DEI consultants to come in and do workshops. And very often, the results are the opposite of what they hope for. They try to bring down prejudice in the workplace, and it goes up after the DEI workshop. What's going on there? Well, it's probably because a lot of these workshops, I'm not going to say all of them, but I've been to one or two, a lot of them actually are a form of indoctrination. They don't engage people in their freedom. They often come in and tell people, you are bad people who believe bad things, and we're going to tell you to stop believing bad things and start believing good things. People resist that. People don't like being told that kind of stuff. And so you can try impose things. it generally backfires, right? And so we shouldn't try to impose Catholicism. We should make a proposal. A second thing, you can be explicit about your position without imposing it, right? When you're above board about what you're proposing, you can allow for healthy engagement, critique, or disagreement. I've talked to theology teachers who said sometimes the best students in their class is the honest atheist, right? The person who challenges honestly, not the person who's trying to trip you up, not the gotcha questions, the person who's honestly pursuing the truth, who's coming from a different point of view. When you engage with them honestly, everybody learns. Everybody learns when that's done well, right? So you can make a bold proposal and then allow people to engage and even to disagree. And finally, making a proposal isn't brainwashing or indoctrination, but sometimes pretending to be neutral can be the prerequisite for that. You can suggest that what you're doing is neutral, but you're actually making real claims, right? If you say, the question of God's existence is not part of what we deal with here, you can believe whatever you like on that matter of opinion in your own private time, in your own home or place of worship, you are not being neutral. You are saying something very bold about which questions matter and which questions don't, right? And you're saying that pursuing truth on this question is actually kind of irrelevant. It's only a sort of matter of a private opinion, and truth is not even really in the game, right? That's a bold claim, pretending not to be a bold claim. Here's another example. Do you know how this one ends? Don't teach students what to think, teach them how to think. Well, please do. Please teach them how to think. I'm all for it. But notice what I'm doing with this statement. If I say don't teach people what to think, teach them how to think, I just told you what to think. But I pretended not to, right? I've made a claim and pretended not to be making a claim. We don't need to play that game in a Catholic school. We can make the claim and then we can let people engage, right? Let's go at it. You want to be I love it if there's honest atheist students in a Catholic school. My motto is, if you want to be an atheist in a Catholic school, we're going to make you the best darn atheist you can be, right? Let's go for it, right? Let's engage with the stuff. If you're an atheist who wants to know true things, you're on my team. Let's do it, right? Couple things we don't need to do. You don't need to just tack Catholic on all over the place in an artificial way to check a box, right? Sometimes in math class, you're just going to do math that day because you're pursuing the truth, and truth is good, and that's what we do. You don't need a Bible verse for every day. You don't need to talk about church teaching every day. Sometimes you should, but don't do it in a way that's artificial or forced. And a second consideration is that each discipline should retain its own integrity. So teaching from a Catholic point of view doesn't mean that every class becomes theology class, right? You still do science, and you do it well in science class. You still do literature, and you do it well in language arts class. Sometimes you're going to look at them in a bigger frame, and there's going to be theological questions that intersect with them or that give a context, but that doesn't mean you stop doing those kinds of things, right? A short way to put that is science questions deserve science answers, but there are also questions about science that are not science questions, and those are worth looking at too. We'll finish up with just a couple little examples. I find the best way you can do this work is making the classroom open for the students' natural curiosity to ask the big questions. Sometimes you need to prompt those kinds of things with your lesson planning, but you can actually, if you haven't trained them out of it, kids are naturally looking to make connections. So Miss Wormwood says, if there are no questions, we'll move on to the next chapter. Of course, Calvin has a question. Certainly, Calvin, what is it? Calvin, what's the point of human existence, right? What are people for? Miss Wormwood says, I meant any questions about the subject at hand. Oh, frankly, I'd like to have the issue resolved before I expend any more energy on this, right? Why does anything that I'm doing here matter? They naturally want to ask the big questions Turn them loose, right? A teacher in Winnipeg told me one day a student was overcome by the fact that math worked. Have you ever had that moment where you're just like, it's ridiculous that this even works, right? Why is it? And so she put up her hand one day and she said, Miss, who invented math, right? Turn them loose, you know? Don't say, hey, Susie, we're busy. We got to go back to math class. No, you said like, class, did you hear that question? What do you think? There's 25 ways that conversation could go, and they're almost all good, right? You don't even have to get the right answer. You just have to show them that that's a real question that's worth engaging. Do humans invent math? Do we discover math? A little of each somehow? Is God put math there to be discovered? Are there patterns inherent in creation? Is it all a cosmic accident? Those are all great questions, right? A last one. A student in Middletown, Connecticut knew that her science teacher was a very faithful woman and put up her hand and said, how can you be so sure of your Catholic faith and teach science? Well, it's a great opportunity to share your own testimony, and I think teachers should be ready. You're never going to get a better chance to share your own testimony than if a student asks for it, right? So you should be ready for that. But maybe before you do, you turn the question around, right? Tell me more about that. What do you think is the tension here? Oh, interesting. Class? Any other considerations, right? You could have a really fantastic conversation, and then when you share your testimony, you've given it 25 landing places among those students, right? So sometimes teachers might worry, you know, in order to be able to do this, I don't have time to go get a master's degree in theology. I have my expertise in the area I have my expertise in. You don't necessarily need all the answers. Sometimes all you need is just some good questions and to be able to engage people with asking those questions. So I'll wrap up there and happy to take some Q&A for the next little bit. Thank you so much for coming out here tonight.